So we are in the old medieval Viking quarter of Dublin, and I know this doesn't look very Viking-esque, but it is part of history, indeed the more recent history. So Dublin may not be synonymous with the Vikings, but it's definitely synonymous with Guinness. And these apartments were actually built by Guinness at the start of the 1900s. So it was a housing development, a housing trust known as the Ivy Trust, named after Lord Ivy, who was one of the Guinnesses. So what you had here before this was built was probably some of the worst slums in Europe. And the Guinness family took the poor people out of the slums, they built these brand new houses, and they allowed them to live in them with reasonable rents. So I guess so many families felt like they won the lottery. And because the Ivy Trust is still an independent organisation that is independent from the local Dublin Council, families, generations have lived in these beautiful looking buildings. So it's just an interesting part and definitely an interesting architectural legacy of Guinness. So down the street, we're going to head towards Dublin Castle. So we're going to enter in by the side entrance of Dublin Castle, and we're going to see kind of where Dublin started. Then we're going to go up to the lower yard, see one of the best preserved parts of the old castle, and then finally into the upper courtyard, where so many pivotal points and parts of Irish history took place. This street that we're on has a very interesting name. It's called Sheep Street. At least it was in Irish. So it was called Sheep Street, but the British authorities, who were pretty much the longest residing inhabitant of Dublin Castle, thought that Sheep Street didn't sound so fancy, didn't sound so stately, didn't sound so imperialist, so let's name it something better. So they simply called it Ship Street. So here we are. If you can see that, it says Ship Street Little. And just above it, now let me go see if I can zoom in here. You will be able to see the sign in Irish. So of course, in Ireland, all official signs have to be in the two languages. Irish, or Irish Gaelic, or Gaeilge is the number one language, and then number two is English. So that's why Irish is on top. Of course, everyone speaks English here, or at least tries to. It might not sound like it. And everyone who goes to the education system has to learn Irish. So we'll talk about that at a different point, but the Irish reads Sráid na Gírach Bheag. So that means street of the sheep little. So Ship Street Little, basically. So there we go. We are about to go into Dublin Castle, and as you can see, there's some kind of imposing looking buildings around here. And of course, these buildings would have housed the British Army at a time, or at least a contingent of it. So here we about to enter into the old entrance of Dublin Castle. One of the wonderful things about the tourism industry here in Dublin is that it's done a fine job of showing where you are in regards to ancient Dublin. So if you're looking for a modern map, this is not very helpful, but it is quite interesting. And you can see there that little circle with the asterisks within it, that marks where we are. So kind of just southwest of that rectangular enclosure, which of course is Dublin Castle. And there we go, the rest of the ancient city of Dublin, roughly around the year 1500. So just doing a bit of works here at the minute. Nowadays, Dublin Castle has various functions. It's used partly by the police service. Indeed, there is a museum. So An Garda Síochána is the name for the police here in Ireland. And it means guardians of the peace, which is a lovely name. And of course there's no Irish equivalent. I mean, you can call them the police, but everyone refers to them as the guards or the Gardaí. And this was set up initially to kind of separate them from the British predecessors. And so it kind of set a different mark. Anyway, this is part of Dublin Castle, and it is a bit mad with all the different colors, right? It kind of looks like a bit like Lego. So you might go to Denmark and see some Lego castles, but here in Dublin we have our own. And they kind of represent the new colourful present and future of Dublin as contrasted with its dark, moody, sullen, morose past. So, of course, we'll explore Dublin Castle in just a little while. But before we do that, we've got this lovely building here, which was given over a few decades ago for the Chester Beatty collection. So Chester Beatty was this Irish American who obviously had a great fondness for Ireland, but probably even more so, had a love for antiquities regardless of where they were. So he was a collector, and he came to fame, he won his fortune really through the last Colorado gold rush in the 1840s, I believe, and traveled around the world collecting an incredible amount of objects, particularly literary works. So this might have been things like, Mughal texts from the 17th century, a whole lot of Korans. It's amazing how many Korans he collected. Dublin, because of Chester Beatty's collection, Dublin has the second biggest collection of Korans in the world, which is a bit random, and you would never guess Dublin if someone asked. But there you go, and I suppose it's kind of ties in with Ireland's great literary heritage, the fantastic contribution that Ireland has made to the world. So I think it's not completely esoteric and not completely distant to say that the Chester Beatty Library should be here. So it's a beautiful library. It was a huge museum, huge collection, so they can only fit a little bit in it at a time, which is why they have rotating exhibitions. Unfortunately, there's nothing on at the moment because, of course, it's COVID and it's practically closed. Now, over here, we have a monument to the Special Olympics. So Ireland hosted the Special Olympics way back in 2003, and it was the first Olympics that we were able to host. We vied for position to become a candidate for the Olympics in the 1930s. I can't remember which one, but attempting to hold the Olympics for such a brand new country, considering that Ireland had only won independence in 1922, and by won I mean it was a draw. We didn't exactly win, but we won independence, shall we say, and in order to kind of impress upon the world that Ireland was an independent, proud, confident, and self-sufficient country, Ireland intended to, put forth its application to host the Olympics. And still today, we probably could be, we wouldn't be a suitable candidate to host the Olympics. We don't have the sporting facilities or the organization. Anyway, going from the Olympics, we're kind of back to the castle. This is the whole castle complex, and it is a smorgasbord of architectural designs. It's very interesting. But this piece here is called the Coach House, and there's a little story connected to it. You can take the story with a grain of salt, but I'll tell you the story anyway, okay? So the history of it, we don't let the facts get in the way of a good story, as we say here in Ireland. But before I tell you about that story, I'm just going to do a slow panorama of this area, because the architectural styles on display are very diverse. It's a very interesting place to come, and as you can see from the benches, sit, have your lunch. A nice little quiet area away from the main streets. And there you go, a wonderful view of the rest of the castle. And as I said, I'll tell you about that in a few minutes. But back to our coach house. So legend has it that when Queen Victoria was coming to visit Dublin, they were getting her room ready there in the state apartments. That's the central building there. So they imagine just the middle floor. So the servers and everybody, all the officials were looking around, you know, making sure they tidied everything up, folded everything the right way. And then one of them looked out the window and went, "Oh God, will you look at that?" And of course, what they saw right here were some of the worst slums in Europe. This is back in the 1840s. So they thought, well, the Queen can't be looking upon these vile cretins. God, no. These, you know, belligerent stuff. No, can't be looking at them. So what they decided to do was take them out of their poverty and do exactly what Guinness did, build brand new buildings for them that were safe, that were free from squalor and disease, you know, no rats running around there, and give them new lives. Oh wait, no, they built a wall. They didn't do that, they just built a wall. So this is practically a wall to block the view. And it's quite interesting because you could make the comment that that was a frequent policy adhered to by the British throughout the 7 or so centuries of English/British control of Ireland, to just kind of ignore the problems in Ireland, particularly when Ireland became part of the United Kingdom from 1801 onwards. And of course, probably the most famous example of the British either failing to look and recognise the problems in Ireland, or just intentionally ignoring them and neglecting them, is the Great Potato Famine of the 1840s. And indeed, this is the reason why so many poor people were here in this vista, in this area, by the end of the 1840s. So there you go, nice little story to kind of coincide. Not really a nice story, but an interesting one at that. So just reversing here, I always found it was quite interesting. It took me a while to notice it, but those buildings behind it, you may think, oh God, isn't it a pity they built them? And of course, you know, cities have to be living cities. They have to progress. New things have to be built. And that's just the way life goes. You can't live in a museum unless you want to move to Bruges in Belgium. So the architecture of Dublin and the planning permission, the planning rules, are actually quite good at respecting the old ways. This might not seem like a good example, but notice the crenellations on the top of the coach house and how they are at least hinted to or matched by this design on the building behind there. Right, that's actually Dunnes Stores headquarters. Dunnes Stores is the biggest retailer in Ireland. So anyway, I thought that was quite interesting. Now, there is a little design here on this green lawn here. And to get a better view of it, we're just gonna take a little walk up this ramp. So it is a circular lawn, and on it you have what you'll see is an interlaced design. We'll go all the way to the top, why not? It won't take us that long. Dublin is a very flat city. Pretty much Dublin Castle is the only hill there, so you'll have no problem walking around. Now, let me see, here we go. Okay, so if I do this, you can get an idea of this wonderful Celtic interlace design. It doesn't really look like it is anything, but believe it or not, where it ends there are what looks like heads. You might not be able to see it from here. Let's go back down and you'll see. So those heads, some would say, oh, it looks like a snake. They're snakes, right? Because I can see the eyes and the shape of the head. And of course, you know, some would say, oh, snakes. Ireland doesn't have any snakes. Because why? Because St. Patrick. St. Patrick rid Ireland of the snakes, which is really an allegory for explaining that Patrick had rid Ireland of the serpentine druids or paganism. So people start thinking about that, and that's really, if you see snakes in Ireland, that's immediately what Irish people think of, because we don't have snakes. So it must be about St. Patrick. So there we go. But they are not snakes. They are eels, river eels. So the reason they're here is because once upon a time, this whole lawn and even a bigger section of it was a pool. And the pool was fed by the River Poddle. Now the River Poddle flowed practically where I walked today. So where we started down towards Dublin Castle gates, that's where the River Poddle flowed. And it flowed, of course, right past the state apartments, right past the Chapel Royal there, and eventually went into the River Liffey, which is the main river in Dublin today. The River Poddle is still here, but now it's more of a puddle than a river. But once upon a time, it rained more in Ireland, which we're fascinated to hear, and this was a pool. And this was where the Vikings came. This is where they landed when they first arrived in this area. Now at the time, some would say there was a church or a few churches nearby. Some would say one of the churches was where St. Patrick's Cathedral is today, which is just a stone's throw behind us, roughly in that direction, if it means anything to you. And there was no settlement here until the Vikings came. The ones that came here generally came from Norway, and they visited Ireland before for, you know, a good old rape and pillage. They came to this area in 841, got off their boats here, tied them up here, and set up a fortification where Dublin Castle is today, on that slight incline, as you'll see. So the name of Dublin is actually named after this pool. The pool was very black, and the Irish had already named everything in Ireland before the Vikings had come, so they had called it Blackpool, which in Irish is Dublin. So Dublin, Dublin. There you go. So Dublin means Blackpool. Now, well, I'll take a little walk around. You'll notice the grass, you know, it is the 3rd of March. And this is probably the worst grass in Ireland because during the summer, generally a lot of folks come on the grass and have a little bit of a walk around and tread it up. But in general, the grass grows very well here in Ireland. We don't need sprinkler systems. We get a drought maybe once every 5 years, and that's just a 2-week period when it doesn't rain. But of course, it's great for everybody except for the dairy farmers. I'm supposed to be farmers for that matter. Oh, yes, interesting little piece over here, kind of following on from my little intro about the police on Garda Síochána. We have a nice little Garda Memorial Garden here, which is quite nice. It's quite interesting. Believe it or not, the names you see here are the names of the Gardaí that were killed in the line of duty. So there's only a few of them, right? So this is all the way back to the establishment of it in 1923. And it just shows you, well, fair play to them, of course, and it's great to honor them, but If this were any state in the US of comparable size and population, you'd have maybe about 5 to 10 times more. So it's just very interesting to show how peaceful Ireland is since the War of Independence and the Civil War that followed it. The police in Ireland don't have guns. The normal Gardaí do not have guns. Only the special branch that deals with gangland crime have guns. And if you want an interesting movie to watch about that, you can watch a movie called Veronica Guerin. So if you type in Veronica, and then Guerin is Guerin, and Kate Blanchett played the Irish journalist in the movie, and it was set in the mid to early 90s, and it's about kind of the gangland crime that Dublin had and how the police, they just weren't able to handle it because they were limited by the legislation. Anyway, interesting one. So I'm showing you this little monument here because it's symbolic. We love our symbols in Ireland. Here you have a sturdy, solid, stone wall, and in it you have this shard of glass. So this is said to represent the fact that the Gardaí, symbols of stability, reliability, and protection, the wall, are human and fragile, hence the glass. I'll go this way. So, more views of the fantastic castle. So normally you can go into the castle and do a tour of the castle. There's some of the Gardaí from the traffic corps, roads policing. You need to pay to go into the castle and do a tour. It's an interesting tour. It touches on the British history and kind of the changes the castle experienced from its establishment at the start of the 1200s. Now this is a fantastic chapel. It's called the Chapel Royal. Royal with cheese. The Chapel Royal, and it was built in the 1815, shortly after the Act of Union. So the Act of Union in 1800 was the British Act that brought Ireland into the United Kingdom. So before this act, there was a kingdom called Great Britain. And in 1800, the Act of Union established the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And it came into effect the following year. So what you have are some interesting figures. There's quite a few figures on here, and we don't actually know all of them that have been represented. We've lost some documentation on that. But around the corner, we'll see two very pivotal figures, not involved, of course, in the building of the chapel or indeed of the castle. Actually, a correction. One of them is involved in building the castle. So we have two figures here, which some believe the fella on the left is King John, who was the ruling king of England when Dublin Castle was started in 1204, and that this fella here was Lawrence O'Toole, who was the presiding Archbishop of Dublin at the time when the Normans, that is the English basically, came into Ireland and took over Dublin. Officially though, this is said to represent Brian Boru, who is kind of the most famous king in medieval Irish history. He died at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. So it's very interesting that the British authorities here, I should say the Irish-born British authorities here, should choose what has been regarded as a nationalistic or a national symbol and figure for Ireland and have him represented on this chapel. So it kind of shows you that, and of course this guy, St. Patrick, right? So, but it kind of shows you that there was a bit of a dichotomy happening in the minds of the Irish officials who worked at Dublin Castle. Because yes, they were Irish, but they were also British, at least officially in the 1800s. So you can kind of see they're trying to, you know, remain loyal to the British, yet keep their own identity. And you'll see this dichotomy throughout Ireland, throughout Irish history, in all the various institutions, contexts and paradigms. So it's not a huge chapel. As I said, it's the Chapel Royal. It's linked to Dublin Castle, and it was just for the authorities there, principally the Lord Lieutenant or the Lord Lieutenant, who was the monarch's representative in Ireland. So he is, he's the captain here. He's the president, if you could say that, for that period. That is up until 1922. So just to get a full perspective here, this is known as the Rate Building. It's another government building, stamp building. And these beautiful buildings here are, they date back to the early 1700s, and these ones from a bit later. And of course, all the buildings over the decades, over the centuries, have been restored. And in fact, most of Dublin Castle doesn't exist anymore, because this naturally was what the castle looked like back in the day. So this is the Records Tower, dating from 1230, and you can see on the stonework how you get this rubble stone, and then it becomes a bit more uniform as you go up. So indeed, a lot of the castle looked like the bottom half of this tower from 1230 up until 1684, when a fire destroyed most of the castle. And the authorities took the opportunity to rebuild and modernize the castle. So for them, it was great, because they went from living and working in a dark, damp, dirty, cold castle to living into something that was a bit warmer, a bit nicer. And if you were visiting people over in England, it was nice to tell them, at least by the end of the 1700s, that you worked in Dublin Castle and how elegant and symmetrical a building it is. So you can imagine this tower, there would have been a similar one at this corner, and then you can see the courtyard within, of course, two more towers on the other sides. So the fire was devastating. Now, they could have kept half of the castle really, but they wanted uniformity, and from what we've seen so far, you could argue that they did not succeed. I don't see any matching Lego parts here. But we're going to take a little brief pause over here to tell you a story, and the story is related to the smallest window there. And of course, you can guess that, unlike the other windows, is particularly old. So that window was probably one of the original windows. And if not, then you can imagine that if this tower did have windows, they would have been that small. And I do say such a strange thing because the Records Tower was one of the prisons of medieval Dublin Castle. And if we were able to, you You can see this window, but there's another window hidden behind the blue boards here that we cannot go and see. But if you're here and they finally finished this construction or whatever they're doing, they're never working on it. They're just up here. It's just scaffolding is established and they're not taking it down or doing any work. But if it's not here, when you get here, go in and take a look at the window and you'll see through and you'll see a corridor leading to the window. But it's not a corridor, it's the thickness of the wall. So the wall is 15 feet thick, right? All around. And that is partly because it was the most, you can't even see the side of the window here. It was the most vulnerable tower that they have, right? Okay, quickly back to the Chapel Royal. Now you have St. Peter holding the keys to heaven, and above him, Jonathan Swift, believe it or not. Jonathan Swift, author of Gulliver's Travels, amongst other works of satire. He was not connected with Dublin Castle per se, but he was connected with St. Patrick's Cathedral. He's linked more to St. Patrick's Cathedral than St. Patrick is, to be honest. But he's a great fella, and he was a great philanthropist, a great helper of the poor in his time. And even he wrote in as well that all his wealth should go towards financing the establishment of a new hospital in Dublin. So an absolute fantastic Dublin character and a great champion of liberty, as is written on his effigy. He decided to write his own effigy, you know. No better man to do it. Okay. So we're gonna pop over here. Maybe we'll take a little seat. Let's see. Yeah, okay. Now, when you do a tour of the castle, you can go down here and you'll be able to see, within the building of course, you'll be able to see the remains of the base of another tower that was there, and you can still see the River Poddle trickling through. So, we'll have a little sit down here. And I'm just going to zoom in. You can see that that little window there. That one right there. So just imagine it's the 1590s, and there's somebody in there, right? It's an Irish prince. His name is Red Hugh O'Donnell, and poor Red Hugh has been in here for 4 years. And you know, he's treated, I would say, reasonably well. He's still alive anyway, but he won't be in here for much longer. No, he's not going to be taken out and beheaded. That would be kind of the normal thing to do here. He's going to escape. So what he does is he waits until there's a party in the castle, and of course, being a prince, he is kind of invited to the party. Him and his cousin, Art O'Neill, and on the way back from the castle they manage to escape, and they do so down the toilet chute, right? So you've probably seen these old medieval castles. The toilet chute was just was really just a hole in the ground from one of the upper floors, right? So he escapes from the castle, comes out, and it's a bit like the Shawshank Redemption, you know. You remember in the movie, he comes out after kind of just pulling himself through a mile of muck, shall we call it. And Red Hugh comes out and he's covered in muck, and he has no cloak on because he had to take it off, the huge Irish woolen cloak, in order to fit down the toilet chute. So he's in his underwear, he's covered in muck, and it's snowing. It's the middle of the night, you're in enemy territory. So there you go, get out of that one. So a bit easier than the character in the Shawshank Redemption. Or sorry, Shawshank Redemption had an easier time, shall we say. So Red Hugh and Art make their way to the south of Dublin because they know they have a contact, an ally there. See, they're not from the south of Dublin, they're from the north of Ireland. Hugh O'Neill, Red Hugh O'Neill is from, Red Hugh O'Donnell, I beg your pardon, is from Donegal in the northwest, and Art O'Neill is from the neighbouring kingdom of the O'Neills. Probably the most prestigious family name in Ireland, going back a good 1600 years. So off they go. They escape south of Dublin. They go into the Wicklow Mountains, where of course it's snowing more and it's even colder. Probably the coldest part of Ireland during winter, even though our winters are generally mild. And they're looking for their contact Byrne, but they can't find him. And they get lost in the snow, they get lost in the blizzard, they collapse in the woods. Oh, and it's, you know, they could make a movie out of this. You know, they look with their dying eyes, they blink and they see some sort of shadow, some sort of silhouette, getting stronger and thicker and bolder, darker from the blizzard, and it's Byrne, and he comes and he rescues them, or at least he attempts to revive them. He doesn't succeed with Art O'Neill, but he does manage to revive Red Hugh O'Donnell, and O'Donnell finally recovers his health a few days afterwards and makes his way back up to Donegal, throws down his sword. Of course, he didn't have it at the time, he just picked up a sword in order to throw it down to declare war on Queen Elizabeth and the English. So he goes on to the website, goes on a TripAdvisor, writes a really bad review. Says, that'll show them. Or as you did at the time, just start a war, start a war. So this became known as the 9 Years' War. Makes it easy to remember the dates. And it ended in 1603. And this was kind of the last huge war that Ireland had, or at least this was our last chance to kick out the English. And we asked the Spanish for help. The Spanish arrived at the wrong end of the country. Typical Spanish. Remember these guys? These are the guys who were going to India, but landed in, Hispaniola, landed in the Caribbean. So they're not very good with maps or directions. So that didn't help. We lost the last battle, having, won quite a few of the battles actually, and we lost the war. And the O'Neills and the O'Donnells surrendered to Queen Elizabeth, and shortly thereafter in 1607, on roughly the 14th of September 1607, a few ships filled with the last nobles of the great ancient Irish Gaelic families set off for continental Europe. In an effort to, re-strategize and consider coming back with a new Spanish or some sort of Catholic army to fight against the Protestant English. That was the plan, but they discovered summer, which we don't really have here, and they thought, this is nice, let's just stay here. No, they definitely tried to come back, but of course their plans were hoisted, they were foiled by Spanish inaction. The Spanish were engaged in a peace with the English, so they didn't want to come. Anyway, that was the 9 Years' War, and it ended in 1603, and that was kind of the beginning of the end of the old Gaelic Irish way of life and order. Alrighty, so when you were to visit Dublin Castle back in medieval times, and you would see this colossal tower, and indeed the whole structure, it'd be a bit like that movie Gladiator, where Russell Crowe's character sees the Colosseum for the first time, and I was just struck in awe with the power of the Roman Empire. So here you have a structure like this. As I said, you have to imagine the rest of it looking like this record tower. And just the visual of it was enough to oppress you. And of course, if you were an Irishman back then, in the medieval period, coming in here, things weren't going well, and they were going to get a heck of a lot worse. So, anyway, let us go into the inner courtyard, see how much worse things go. and finish up. So Dublin Castle is definitely worth going to see with a guide. You really don't get a sense, even within the castle, to be honest, of the sheer historical significance of this place. And it is, it is difficult to tell. So it's brilliant to be in here. Nobody else around. I'll just, since we have it, might as well use it over here. So I'll show you what the medieval castle would have looked like, and then the various stages here. So there we go. You can see up there, the top left, that's the tower we were looking at. And then you can kind of see the Dublin garden there behind. So as I said, this is Dublin. This is the castle, roughly around 1500. And then the fire happened, and this is what it looked like shortly thereafter. And then by the end of the 1700s, it looks very elegant. There was a great painter, an artist called Malton, who came to Dublin in the 1790s, and he did these lithographs, these drawings of some of the most impressive buildings in Dublin, and it really captures Dublin at its golden age, at least its architectural golden age. And indeed, the last 20 years of the 1700s were financially successful for Dublin before the Act of Union. So you can imagine that Dublin was a bit like Boston at the time. Nice things were being built, wealth was being generated. Of course, a bit of it was leaving, going back to England, but the city was benefiting. We had a rebellion in 1798 to kind of realize our potential and strike free from the English, just like the Americans had done. And the revolution in France had inspired us as well. So you can see the inspiration for both the American and the French revolutions culminating in Ireland as the 1798 rebellion. Indeed, the French did help, but unfortunately it was not to be, and the rebellion failed. And besides, all the the physical torture and death and massacres that took place, probably the worst thing to happen for Dublin, for Ireland, was the Act of Union. From 1800 onwards, the money started leaving Ireland, and we entered a recession that you could say lasted until the 1990s. Just the stagnation and the backwardness of the country didn't start to reverse until the 1990s, when we experienced what was known as the Celtic Tiger. It's a great economic boom of the country. Now, Dublin Castle, this little courtyard here, back in medieval times, this was where people were tortured. I'm not going to tell you about one particular torture that I love telling about, because it might be a bit too much for people. But this is where people were tortured, beheaded, and then even sometimes buried within the courtyard itself, right here in the grounds, which is quite ridiculous. So, this place, as an institution and as a building, was kind of the main target for Irish nationalists throughout the centuries. This was Mordor from Lord of the Rings. This was the most evil place in Ireland as far as Irish people were concerned. And so they were fighting against it. They were fighting against everything the castle stood for. Oppression. This castle was the reason your children were starving. This castle was the reason your culture was dying. And so British oppression, or rather Dublin Castle, became synonymous for British oppression. And that changed in 1921. 1921, in the middle of the War of Independence, there was a ceremony here to start the end of the war and indeed represent the fact that Ireland was going to get its independence, at least in some form. So you had a ceremony here where the Lord Lieutenant, Lord Fitzalan, handed over the keys of the castle to Michael Collins, who, among other titles, was the Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Republican Army. And so he literally handed him over the keys, as well as figuratively. So that was the start of Dublin Castle becoming Irish. And this was the way the Irish, you could say, finally conquered the castle, finally took the castle through negotiations and through a treaty. And you can see the Irish tricolour there that always flies here in Dublin Castle and has done since that day. That was the first day when the Irish tricolour was raised and the Union flag of the United Kingdom was lowered. So an incredible day. So there you go, you have the green, white and orange. Green represents the people on the island of Ireland who are Irish and identify as Irish. The orange represents those who identify as British, who, you know, the vast majority today are in Northern Ireland, which is why, one of the reasons why Northern Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom, because of its British affiliations. And the white between them is peace. So the peace between the two peoples, the two traditions, the two kind of customs, and each heritage is respected in this flag. So it's a great flag of kind of coming together, very mature flag, and a flag not for the time it was created, which was the 1840s, but for a future Ireland, a better Ireland. And it's great to see it flying here because Dublin Castle is an example of a better Ireland. You can see you have a blue flag here. You might not be able to make it out what it is, but it is the flag of the European Union. So Ireland joined the EU with the UK in 1973. And that was kind of a great step for us to kind of join the rest of the world because we were heavily reliant on Britain at the time. Britain is still our most important trading partner, but the EU, single most important one, but the EU in itself is far more important than the UK. And indeed, America, the US is very important for Ireland as well. But that flag flies here because when Ireland hosts the presidency of the EU, it takes place here. So there are conference rooms in the Dublin Castle complex behind that building, and in there and then downstairs as well. So you can see the flagpoles here to represent the now 27 countries of the EU. So of course in Ireland, most of us regard the EU as very positive. The EU has given us a lot of money, helped develop a lot of projects, because Ireland was ruled by another power for a good 700 years. So we still haven't gotten used to managing and leading ourselves, So I'm going to finish up by telling you a few more important things. Since independence, we've started to change this building. We wanted to kind of tear it down because of all the dark memories. Thankfully, the authorities didn't do that, and they decided instead to change how Irish people think about the building, how they look upon the building, how they regard it. So the first step, as I said, was probably with that event in 1921 where the keys were handed over. The next significant event was in 1938 when the first president was inaugurated here, Douglas Hyde. So by having the president inaugurated here, it kind of shows that we've taken what was a symbol of our oppression and made it into a symbol of our independence. We have a president, so the Queen of England is not in charge of Ireland like she is de facto in Canada and Australia. So that's important for us to have a president. Current president is Michael D. Higgins, and he's a lovely man. Everyone thinks he's fantastic. He doesn't do anything, so it's great to have a politician that everyone likes and can't blame for doing the wrong things, because he doesn't really have many responsibilities. He just signs the parliament in, the new government in, and decides whether we go to war, which is generally a hard no. It's an etched in stone war. Etched in stone no, because of course we've had a good 700 years of war, so we're in credit for the next couple centuries, let's say. So the president was the first step, and then the next step was the results of referendums that have been held here. So one of the most significant ones was in 1995, referendum on divorce. It passed and the results were enacted here. So you can imagine a lot of people, particularly women in abusive relationships, could finally get out. So now you have kind of Dublin Castle and this scene reminding them of their chance of freedom. And then you had the referendum on gay marriage, which passed by about a 2/3 majority. And then to a lesser extent, in terms of its significance, you had the abortion referendum recently as well. So all of these kind of show Dublin Castle as the place where people's freedoms were not taken away, but were given. Let's see if I can just switch this around here. I don't know if I can turn, there we go. No, I can't turn it around, no, since I've done this. The most important, though, recent event that's happened here was in 2011, when Queen Elizabeth came here. This is the first time she visited Ireland. She'd never been. There hadn't been a British monarch here since 1911, so 100 years. And she came to visit Dublin Castle, and she was in the blue room, in the main banqueting hall in Dublin Castle, and she stood up to give a speech. And everyone was asking, is she standing up? She is quite tiny. So she stood up, and the first words she said were, "A chuchtron agus a carcha," which means president and friends. And the symbolism of this was huge, because what she had said was president and friends, but she had said it in Irish. And for someone who had represented the oppression, the supplantation of not just Irish culture, but various cultures around the world, this was huge. Obviously, herself, she's a lovely lady and everything, and the British Empire is kind of going downhill since she came on board, which is fine and everything. But the previous monarchs, who, let's say, were a bit more militant, a bit more involved, so it was just great to see a symbol of that long line finally recognize to us that she had said, we respect, we honor your culture, and maybe a slight nod to the history of the destruction of that culture, because the Irish language is probably the most injured aspect of Irish culture as a result of British imperialism and colonization here in Ireland. So it was a wonderful moment for Ireland and for Irish-British relations. And it was a great step in the right direction to get us to the future of mutual understanding and respect, which I think we have in a lot of areas in society anyway. But it was just great to see that. So there you can see Dublin Castle. There's so much history here, over 700 years. You may not be able to see it in the walls, but I can feel it on these very stones. I can nearly see the blood stains that 1,000 years couldn't wash off. When I walk in here, when any Irish person walks in here and knows their history and realizes that most of the, let's say, the bad history, when the English were here from 1200 onwards, it revolves around this site, Dublin Castle. This is where the Vikings had their first fort here. So this is the start of Dublin, and this is the end of our tour. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope I'm in frame, and thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions or comments or suggestions or corrections. It's the first time I've been doing a tour is, I think, nearly a year, so I hope I remembered everything correctly. Okay.